Welcome at the webinar about investing in post-conflict affected areas and conflict affected areas of the pension fund agreement. And we're organizing this together with Pax and Achmea. The speakers of today are Egbert Wesseling, a senior advisor at Pax for Peace. He will talk about tools for investors and about the paper we're writing jointly together with Frank Wagemans of Achmea, also the final speaker of today, and myself. After Egbert, Anita Ramasastri takes over. She is the chair of the Young Working Group on the issue of human rights and transnational corporations. And furthermore, she is a director and professor at the Washington University. Thereafter, Benjamin Gatland takes over. He's the director of social sustainability at Heineken. He lived for a year in Sudan in 2003, so he has some underground experience with difficult areas, and he will share some of the experiences Heineken has with regard to operations in conflict-sensitive areas, and also about their own policies. Lastly, Frank Wagemans will go into the paper we have written in concept, which should help investors to make a judgment call on investing in conflict-affected areas. I'll also already talk to you a bit through the schedule of today. There's room for questions. I would like to tell you a little bit more background on the pension fund agreement of in Dutch Pensioenfondsconvenant. It's a collaboration of over 80 pension funds, about 90% of asset under management by all the pension funds in the Netherlands, and together with NGOs, labor unions, and the government. There's a wide and a deep track. The deep track focuses on several cases. We're now talking about the wide track, which aims to accelerate the implementation of the OECD guidelines, the guiding principles of business and human rights throughout the whole sector. We're not going to focus deeply on what the OECD guidelines are today. However, it consists of the basic things you are well aware of usually, like human rights, labor rights, etc. However, what is important is that access to remedy is a component that is easily overlooked, while it's important not only to stop a negative impact, but also to provide solutions how to solve it. And also the concept of due diligence is an important and more complex one. Today we're focusing on these things, but only focusing on investing in post-conflict affected areas. So with that said, I would like to introduce Egbert to take over.
Well, thank you very much, Martijn, and thanks to the Sociaal-Economic Council and the Pension Federation for co-organizing this event. So I'm working for Pax, it's a Dutch peace movement, and we're signatories to the 3 Dutch agreements on responsible investment in the financial sector, the banking, the pension funds, and insurance companies. And we think that those agreements form a very major step ahead. And it's now time to implement, and we see this seminar as a step towards further implementation of the agreements and inclusion of the OECD guidelines and the UNGP requirements into the business conduct of Dutch companies, financial companies in particular. Now, we have, of course, a very long history of engagement in conflict and peace building, conflict prevention, and we have experience with the role of companies in conflict, both positive and negative. And we experienced that very few companies have the required level of awareness of the way that they're contributing. They can also contribute by doing nothing, just by being present or by actively making business decisions on conflict. I mean, there's no neutrality in conflict. There's always some way of impacting conflict. And there's very little awareness about that. And we also see companies actually benefiting from conflict and from human rights violations, and that is very serious. because conflicts, no doubt, violent conflicts are among the most important sources of serious and gross human rights violations in the world. Now, so what we really see that's missing is conflict awareness, and we hope to contribute to filling the gap, the conflict dimension of human rights due diligence. We see very happily the business community picking that up already. Case in point is, of course, Heineken that will be speaking later, and that has started developing a conflict policy itself a few years ago already. We see, for instance, in the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights, where there are 30 of the largest oil, gas, and mining companies of the world present. They have a subgroup working on conflict impact assessment tool for themselves. And we have, of course, the momentous recent development, the UN Working Group coming out with, I think, a very important, very good report on the conflict dimension of the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles. I was supposed to talk about tools and guidance for conflict human rights due diligence, but I'm not going to talk about it because they don't exist. That's the whole point, and they should be developed. We have, with the Socioeconomic Council and the Pension Federation, we've started developing a tool and the guidance that will be shared after the webinar. But I think we still need some rounds of consultation before that, and I hope that can be helpful. But for now, this is all I had to say. I think it's an urgent issue, it's an important issue, and I think it should not be too difficult to include it in existing due diligence methodologies. So that's it for PAX for now. I'd like to give the floor back to Martijn. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Egbert. Questions will be postponed after all the presentations, and I'd like to ask Anita to take the floor as she's all the way from the US in our webinar. Thank you, Anita.
Human rights and to act with due diligence to avoid becoming linked or involved in human rights abuses in all contexts. So the risk of becoming involved with human rights abuses in conflict contexts in turn also translates into material risks for investors, as noted by the US SIF report of 2018, which indicated that conflict risk was the leading ESG criteria among institutional investors. And legal requirements, as many of you know, are underway, notably with the EU Sustainability Disclosure Regulation, which requires investors to disclose how they assess risk to people in their investments, coming into force in March 2021. But beyond the well-known statement of fact that human rights risks are intensified in conflict-affected contexts and the specific attention dedicated to the issue in the Guiding Principle, so Guiding Principle 7 actually refers to this idea kind of heightened impacts and therefore the need for special guidance. The truth is that not much has been done concretely, and Egbert already signaled that. While there are some multi-stakeholder initiatives, the due diligence guidance by the OECD and conflict minerals regulations have contributed to a greater push for conflict-sensitive due diligence by business. Beyond these sort of little pockets or bubbles of awareness, the seriousness of the issue has not been matched by adequate attention and action, neither by governments, businesses, or investors to date. This was precisely the focus and key message contained in our most recent report to the UN General Assembly. This report, entitled Business, Human Rights, and Conflict-Affected Regions Towards Heightened Action, was produced after 2 years of research and stakeholder engagement, including multilateral and bilateral consultations with state, civil society, businesses, and experts in regions around the world. While the report targets governments and companies and did not focus on institutional investors for reasons of time and space, many of the considerations should still help inform investor due diligence efforts by clarifying expectations of portfolio companies, particularly when these operate in or involved in conflict-affected settings through their value chain. So that's a key message for today, right? Which is that this, we hope, will inform what you are doing with due diligence. The title, Towards Heightened Action, is because we wanted to highlight the concept of heightened due diligence that has become synonymous with what is required for operating in conflict-affected contexts. While the guiding principles do not refer to a different type of due diligence for conflict-affected regions, they're based on a concept of proportionality, meaning the higher the risk, the more complex the processes. And because, as the guiding principles state, the risk of gross human rights abuses is heightened in conflict, actions by states and due diligence by business and investors should be heightened accordingly. To elaborate a bit, the guiding principles clarify that the complexity of any human rights due diligence process depends upon the operating context, the size and nature of the business activity under scrutiny, the relationships associated with those activities, and the severity of the potential adverse human rights impacts. In conflict-affected situations, the complexity is increased by the operating context. State structures are weak or non-existent. Business relationships are also of concern, as some actors may be active participants to the conflict or abusers, and the potential wanted to support is the need to build conflict analysis into the due diligence process. Standard human rights due diligence, even if robust for other contexts, will not be enough. A reason for that is that activities linking business to conflict are often not perceived as salient human rights issues, and therefore might be ignored or under prioritized in standard human rights impact assessments, right? Those really just sort of what I call plain vanilla. For example, a business is likely to engage public or private security owing to the presence of conflict. Even if such security forces behave exemplarily, their presence affects the local context and may lead to an escalation of violence. Hiring practices that are fully compliant in terms of human rights might fuel a perception of advantage of a specific group over another, right? Again, in the general context, maybe not, but unless you understand conflict dynamics, then hiring practices, right, may lead to an escalation of grievances and violence. A simple land acquisition may fuel conflict when it is predicated on the prior dispossession or forced eviction of communities. So that's really our underlying message, right? That salience changes when you bring in the conflict analysis. At worst, acting in an apparently human rights compatible way might in fact fuel conflict dynamics. In conflict context, therefore, while human rights due diligence requiring businesses to assess, avoid, or mitigate adverse human rights impacts remains valid and necessary, it needs to be complemented by conflict-sensitive approach. This involves gaining a sound understanding of the two-way interaction between activities and context and acting to minimize negative impacts. For business, it's not just a question of whom they are dealing with, but where they are going, which requires understanding the specific local context. It is essential for business to consult with local communities and to develop appropriate tools for screening business partners as part of human rights due diligence, as a way to recognize that in many cases it will hardly be possible to invest in a way that is compliant with international standards. So in this context, we're talking about sort of what customer is, but looking in context at the human rights records of the individuals and the businesses who may be implicated in a business relationship. And this is something that is nascent and we hope will grow over time. This may seem obvious for a lot of us today, but as I mentioned earlier, while conflict risk was a leading ESG criteria, how many have a clear actual framework of analysis to act on it? This can be said of others as well. This is why the report looks at the state of play in the field of business and human rights and conflict and aims at clarifying practical steps that states acting alone when acting as members of multilateral organizations and business should take to implement the guiding principles. So, for example, the report proposes triggers and indicators that should lead to heightened action by states, business, and the UN system. Such a list would be an interesting starting point for investors wanting to trigger enhanced due diligence. Again, when should enhanced due diligence be used? Among the triggers and indicators that should lead to heightened action that we highlight, and these come from the world of atrocity prevention, are armed conflict and other forms of instability, weakness or absence of state structures, record of serious violations of international human rights and humanitarian law, as well as various warning signals, whether gradual or sudden, which produce an environment conducive to serious human rights abuses or would suggest a trajectory towards their purpose. The report also explores the challenges posed by post-conflict reconstruction and peace building, including the key issues of access to remedy and transitional justice, as well as impacts of our cyber age on conflict dynamics and on human rights in these conflict contexts. The conclusion of the report brings a mixed picture. On the one hand, there is real progress, right? Some states have already started to address the issue of business and conflict more actively. The most significant developments really are related on curbing the trade in so-called conflict minerals. On this, we see a clear emerging kind of regulatory coherence, which increases the ability of states to address business activities in or connected to conflict-affected regions. We also see in the security sector, as Egbert mentioned, the voluntary principles for the extractive industries and the International Code of Conduct for security service providers. So that's on the positive side. On the other hand, the immediate counterpoint is that there isn't much progress beyond the security sector and conflict minerals. And most states lack policy coherence or serious appetite to develop policies, regulations, and enforcement mechanisms to effectively address the risk of gross human rights abuses. And part of that has to do with silos. And our report sort of talks about how states need to act. But the key message here is that to some extent, because there is this general notion that business and investment is good for peace building and so forth, we ignore the issue of the heightened risk of human rights abuses. And so states have to take specific action. In terms of financial sector actors, the report specifically addresses the role of the international financial institutions in post-conflict settings, and we focus on the fact that, in order to attract investors, there still needs to be adequate human rights safeguards in place. Otherwise, there's a risk of reigniting old conflicts, and this is an issue flagged several times in the working group's consultations. And so we really want the international financial institutions, such as the World Bank, the IFC, African Development Bank, and others, to really think about this idea of heightened human rights due diligence, right, and basic human rights due diligence in their own policies. And so international financial institutions also have a role to align with the guiding principles. So I'm just a few last observations to close. As you know, there are really few customized tools for investors on conflict-sensitive human rights due diligence. To take the example closest to you, the Dutch Pension Funds Agreement on Responsible Investment mentions conflict, but provides little concrete guidance. So this is also something that we hope that will be explored further by investor platforms in dialogue with other stakeholders and building on existing resources, such as the Investor Alliance for Human Rights Toolkit and the good work being done in the Netherlands in bringing together different actors in the field of responsible investment. As concrete risks tend to be context and sector specific, there isn't any one-size-fits-all solution. So a report does highlight that specific sectors may need to really look at this in a different way. And we single out the technology sector, both in relation to means of warfare and the role of online platforms, such as Facebook, in fueling human rights abuse and conflict dynamics. On the topic of conflict-sensitive human rights due diligence for investors focused on the ICT sector, one useful existing research by the Investor Alliance initiative, but more is needed. So this is why our report really focuses on the fact that we need to identify practical solutions. We need a multi-stakeholder initiative with the overarching objectives of operationalizing the human rights responsibilities of the sector, this is the tech sector, and setting out practical guidance and standard for the provision of cyber services. In conclusion, let me just quickly turn to the upcoming 10th anniversary of the UN Guiding Principles in June this year. We see this anniversary as an opportunity to reflect on progress and challenges, and more importantly, to make a renewed push for scaled up global implementation. And so we've engaged in a really big stock taking. We've done a lot of work engaging with investors, of course, in the financial sector, because we do believe that this is one area that has been overlooked in the business and human rights discourse in the past decade. But we see the tremendous leverage and potential of the investor community in terms of really scaling up implementation of the goals. And we want to say that we think this is incredibly important when we focus on conflict and fragile contexts. So we see the power of investors, but we see the power of investors when it comes to issues of conflict. And I just want to close in saying, our report really focuses on the whole cycle, right? Conflict in the smallest context in communities where there are development projects, the conflict cycle of violence in conflict, and then we focus on post-conflict. And we really want to say that the post-conflict context is where we heard a lot on the ground about the sort of general belief that business coming back into an economy is a good thing for peace. And our message back is that this is precisely where the international financial community and investors can play a very key role in ensuring that any business that re-enters those markets does so using heightened human rights due diligence and a conflict-sensitive approach, right? That really is so that we do not reignite or escalate conflict. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your own observations and questions today.
Thank you so much so far, and Anita, this was a very interesting story on and what I really liked was you made the link between know your customer, which is in the financial sector a total logical idea, and then what you have to do with your investee companies. And usually you focus on what the investee company does and you do your ESG screening, but this is also about context, and that's a pretty complex thing sometimes to do. So could you maybe elaborate a little bit on what do you think is should consist of the heightened human rights assessment, and what are the first steps for investors if this is still quite new to you? How can you make a start on this?
Great. Well, I think our report was really about connecting a lot of existing fields, sort of breaking down the silos. So our report recommends, again, there is a whole world out there of conflict sensitivity and in the peace and security field, right? So there are groups and there is advice around what conflict sensitive business practice looks like. So what we say is, what are the sort of key good practices that come from that field that should be embedded into human rights due diligence framework? What we saw, and to give you one example, such as Myanmar, that once Myanmar reopened, even though it remains a very fragile context, as we all know, the sector-wide specific human rights due diligence tools that were developed in the early days to aid companies didn't focus as much on what the underlying nature of the conflict or conflicts in Myanmar were. They were much more sort of, I hate to use the word generic, but they were asking more basic questions around, gender issues. Maybe they would ask about ethnic minorities, but not really trying to understand what might be the underlying drivers of the conflict, what's the history of the conflict, who are the different actors, so that we didn't see any of that feeding in. So what we say is, okay, take tools from conflict sensitivity and say, what are the types of questions you would ask in those contexts, and build them into your human rights impact assessment. Rather than just having a sort of generalized human rights impact assessment that you kind of take off the shelf and use anywhere that you are in the world.
Thank you so much. It's quite about context and know really the context of the company you're investing in. And when it comes to context and heightened due diligence in conflict-affected areas, that's, I think, what the Heineken case is about. So I would like to listen to Benjamin Gatland. Would you please tell us a bit more on the Heineken case?
Great. Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation. Great to be with everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you find yourself. And we certainly feel honored to have the opportunity to share our humble contribution to this important topic. I think the groundwork has certainly been laid by Egbert and Anita, so hopefully we can help land this with a practical case of how we as Heineken have tackled this. I will just share with you a brief presentation on this. So I think for us, this is really, we're talking about our approach to due diligence in volatile environments, but for the avoidance of doubt, and hopefully it comes through in the course of the presentation, I think this is also very much about a mindset within the company, and looking at how we respond to our operations in the context of a volatile environment. I see this really as a priority for several reasons, but not least of which, although optimistic about the future, I think it would be naive to think that many of the countries we operate in will probably not become stable, but may become less stable when we look at the social, economic, the political environment in many of the countries that we operate in. And so how we respond to our operations in these countries, I think, is in many ways a barometer of corporate culture. And whether we lower our standards to the norm or raise our standards to a higher bar is the question we constantly challenge ourselves with. So this is a journey that we've been on, and hopefully it will give you some insights into how we've practically tackled the issue. Now, we started this with a series of extensive interviews internally within the company. We wanted to map out what are the contexts that we've found ourselves in the past, and Egbert mentioned some companies might be surprised that they wouldn't tend to think of themselves as operating in high-risk conflict or post-conflict countries, but we were certainly surprised when you start to map out some of the context that we've faced in the past, and then looking at some of the scenarios that we've actually faced within these contexts. So that was our starting point, and we saw 6 key contexts. The first was in countries where governments lack democratic legitimacy. We also saw ethnic tension. We found civil and political unrest, armed conflict, humanitarian crisis, and a number of other security risks. And then when we looked in each of these in isolation, we found that we had been in situations where we were faced with inappropriate requests, significant economic discrimination, even genocide, significant community unrest around our breweries. We faced coups, rebel groups, latent and post-conflict, humanitarian crisis related to conflict, health crisis, natural disasters, traveling through dangerous places, and security risks related to the hiring of security staff and inexperienced staff. So our first port of call was to map out what the context and the scenarios have looked like in the past and which we could face in the future. We then needed to look at how we prioritize which of our 80 operating companies are potentially in the highest risk and which are heading in a direction of increased risk, and therefore give priority to those countries. So to do that, we needed some data, and we needed a way to quantify what these different contexts and scenarios look like in a qualitative way. And so we took the main elements of governance, socioeconomic, potentially vulnerable groups, conflict and security, and then we attempted to put a quantitative data point on each of those to help keep track across these 80 operating companies where we see the greatest risk. And you'll see, even under the weighting, that we have put a higher weighting on the potentially vulnerable groups. But then looking at the different factors, we identified sources of information that quantitative rating for each of the main elements. And so once we prepared that, we were able to look at how we start to embed this, and this is really in the in UNGP terms, to integrate and act. And in 2018, we updated our human rights policy, which included a principle called respect for human rights in high-risk contexts. This was one of the 10 principles in our human rights policy. I'm not sure of other companies that have called this out explicitly, but given the weight of the topic, we felt it needed special attention. But in addition to this principle in our human rights policy, we also thought we needed a set of more specific principles which we should hold ourselves against when we're operating in these high-risk contexts. And that's where we arrived at the golden principles or golden rules. So these are things like risk to people is paramount. And that means that we look at our operations through a risk to people lens. Or secondly, consider the risk of everyone connected to our business. It means that our responsibility extends beyond the 4 walls of the brewery or the depot. We need to look up and down our value chain within the country. Thirdly, if we're aware of any impact on people connected to our business, we need to leverage our influence. And that could also be using our leverage in the form of coalitions or with business partners. We also said that potentially vulnerable people need specific attention and protection. So part of this is that we need to be able to identify vulnerable groups within a country that's rated high risk, and we need to ensure that there's specific attention and protection of those vulnerable groups. We also said we should anticipate any issue that might arise by proactively engaging stakeholders. And I think anticipation is a key theme within this whole initiative. It's a large part of what it's all about, preemptive transformation. And I think companies find that once this issue is on their radar, is usually when it's too late. And that's usually when they've lost the ability to use leverage to positively influence the situation on the ground. So this is largely about preemptive transformation and being as proactive as possible. Next to that, we've said we should be as accessible as possible for people who want to raise issues with us. And that is also about informing ourselves of what's going on, but could also be through grievance mechanisms and third-party speak-up tools, for example. Below that, we say we be clear about what people can expect from us. Usually we find ourselves in situations where the expectations are very high, especially in a situation where there's maybe a weak state and expectations for primary healthcare, food, water is often relayed onto us. We need to be very clear about what people can and can't expect from us. And I think, again, this is about being proactive and being transparent and doing what we can, but not raising expectations locally. And lastly, business imperatives do not justify any decision. I think this principle really sums up the 7 before it. This just means that no decision we make commercially should be at the expense of people or a negative contribution to the situation that we find ourselves in locally. So we came up with our golden rules, our golden principles. The next phase in the journey was turning that into actions within the high risk context. And this is where I come back to the initial comment about this is also has a lot to do with leadership, with behaviors and changing the mindset from license to operate to creating societal value in high-risk contexts. And our action plans with operating companies in high risk usually follow 5 key themes. It's knowing the people directly connected to the business, knowing our context, knowing our impact, getting connected, and putting in place a governance structure and training staff. All of these 5 themes will look very different, will have different sub-actions locally, but as a framework, these 5 themes become almost the blueprint for our reporting and internal governance. So under the first one, this is about conducting human rights workshops, value chain mapping, really understanding beyond the 4 walls of the brewery who we are connected. The second about the context is looking at stakeholder mapping. So this includes with local communities, social mapping exercises, conflict dynamics, as well as identifying the most vulnerable groups. And it was mentioned earlier, I think by Anita or Egbert, often that misunderstanding of the complexities of local conflict is a shortfall, and it really requires taking time to understand in depth, and usually through a third party, providing some support and in-depth local knowledge. The third one about knowing our impact is about conducting independent socioeconomic impact assessments, and Egbert also said it well in the beginning. Often companies don't know the impact that they have, both good and bad. It's important to get a balanced view so that you can take action both ways. And the getting connected piece is about employing community liaison officers, putting in place that external speak up, internal communication. And lastly, the governance structure and training staff means we need cross-functional steering committees, local training, including of security personnel and respecting human rights. And so you take a step back and hopefully we have gained some ground in putting in place some structures, awareness, and making a contribution towards that mindset shift that will allow us to continue to operate in countries that are high risk, but do so in a way that that lives up to both the values of the company, but also the international standards and frameworks, not least of which is the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. So that was all from my side.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting to hear what the perspective is in an investee company. Yeah, I got some questions actually. So Heineken clearly made an effort on this, and could you elaborate a bit what made Heineken start to make that effort, and what does it bring to Heineken actually?
I think, if we look at our geographical footprint, we are the most international brewer in the world, and we pride ourselves in being present in many countries around the world. I think part of this initiative is to continue to have those operations in as many countries around the world, but to do so with the right level of integrity and compliance. So I guess as a company, it's about continuing our license to operate, and locally it's about doing the right thing and creating societal value.
Okay, I also saw a hand of Thijs. Thijs, can I give you the floor for your question?
Sure, thank you, and thanks for the presentation, Benjamin. I was just wondering, and Frank will probably talk about that in the next session, the role of institutional investors, of course, but I was wondering how you from a company also look at the added value that investors could bring. You talked about increasing leverage, for instance. Well, how do you look at that? Can you share a bit about it? Thank you.
Sure, Thijs. To be honest, this is an initiative we've talked about much publicly, so jury's still out as to what gains we could make from it. But I think there's certainly a principle of collaboration, and the more entities that we can collaborate with, the more leverage we have. We mentioned Myanmar earlier. When we entered Myanmar a few years ago, the Myanmar Center for Responsible Business, of which the Dutch government is one of the supporters, was a critical stakeholder in guiding us through that process. So I think as we gain more maturity on this topic, we can hopefully bring more investors in as a critical stakeholder, both in terms of leverage and also advice and feedback.
And if you have these discussions with your investors, what are useful questions they could ask to Heineken, but also to other companies? What are where do you start that kind of conversation?
I think the conversation usually starts at quite a high level of due diligence, and more investors are starting to probe a bit more. It's no longer good enough to just give an overview or a high level overview of your due diligence framework. I think investors are wisening up to what is really a credible due diligence framework and what isn't. And I think my encouragement to the investors would be to continue poking, and you'll quickly see which ones can hold up to that credibility claim and which can't.
Okay, continue poking. I like that one. And actually, it's quite difficult to visit a country where Heineken doesn't have a feet on the ground. So local communities differ, of course, but can you say something on how you reach out to local communities? As you stressed that it's important to be as accessible as possible for local communities. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, this will look very, very different in every context, and not just in the high-risk context. In Europe, we also engage with local communities, and I think, yeah, it's a difficult question to ask, Martijn, because it's about local employment. We have, for example, in Africa, the Heineken in Africa Foundation, which supports primary healthcare to the local communities, and that could range from supporting a clinic to purchasing an ambulance. I think the trend is, and maybe even a trend coming back to investors, it's no longer about how we spend our money through a foundation. It's more how we make our money through our operations locally. So this concept of inclusive business and really involving communities in sourcing from, selling to, and partnering with your operations locally is critical.
Thank you so much for story. There is room for some more questions later on, but you gave away already some focus points what investors could do. So that I would like to introduce Frank Wagemans, working at Achmea, and he will elaborate on that. Basically, what are the roles and responsibilities of institutional investors on this? Frank.
Well, thank you, Martijn. Good afternoon. So, conflict areas and responsible investment. I think we had already 3 excellent presentations. So I don't dig into all the details that have already been mentioned. But there is one big question remaining. So what does that mean for investors? And I think for quite a lot of investors, this is a difficult topic. Just to start already with some questions. What are conflict areas? Is there a certain list? How do you cope with? Well, sometimes also conflicts which are seen as political. How do you take a stance as an investor? What does your responsibility as an investor begins and ends? And what can you logically expect from your investees that are active in the conflict area? So that there are quite some questions left. And what we did within the INVB covenant is that we made a small working group and worked on a sort of paper as a sort of first step addressing these topics. And just to make this sort of first building blocks to start working and to start integrating conflict areas as a theme within responsible investment. So what I will do today is, well, it's not in a sense my presentation, but part of the work of a bigger group. I will give you the summary of the draft guidelines we have made, and we are very open to your feedback and comments and questions and things you might have missed in the presentation. Before I dive into all these different building blocks and questions, it's important that responsible investment can have several viewpoints or perspectives. Today we take a normative perspective. So we zoom into the UNGPs, to the OECD guidelines, and then translate that to what does that mean in practice. Does that relate to financial materiality or societal impact? Yes, of course it does. But the normative perspective is a starting point for today. So let's start with one big question. What are actually conflict areas? And that's not an easy question, but fortunately there are quite some organizations which have already digged into this topic. So there are quite some different lists available, which for you as an investor give already a sort of foundation to build your policy and practices. So the list you will see here is a list of the World Bank, which just lists the different countries which are seen as conflict areas. And what you will see is that probably the majority of your investment, of your investees, do not have their headquarters in one of those countries. However, you will probably have quite some companies that are active in relation in these countries or in relation with these conflicts. For example, supplying weapons or weapon production is often the first sector which springs to mind. And is that relevant for conflict areas? Yes, of course. But if you dig deeper, you see that quite a lot of sectors and companies can be involved in those areas. London in Sweden is a very recent example, which the company was active in oil extraction in Sudan, mining operations in Congo. Already mentioned also in the beginning, social media and Myanmar, West Bank, which has been in the news in the Netherlands a few years ago, and also in relation to the involvement of institutional investors, and also as relation to the presentation of Heineken, food and beverage company. So you see that there were quite some companies and sectors which have a very strong link with those areas. Sometimes very directly related with the conflict itself. Sometimes, I would say, almost just active in the region or the country. But as explained today, that also means that in one way or another, you will be linked to the conflict, and you have to risk to be linked to human rights violation, or maybe fueling the conflict. So now we have the list of countries. We have seen that for a regular investment portfolio, this is an important theme. What does that mean for you as an investor and the responsibility you have? Well, if we dive into the UNGPs and the OECD guidelines, governments have the duty to protect, companies have the duty to respect. But what does that mean for institutional investors in practice? And then you look into how can you be linked to certain human rights violations. Well, you can cause them, you can contribute to, and you can be directly linked. In principle, all these three could be relevant for investors. However, as an institutional investor, mainly focusing on investing in public markets, you will probably be a minority shareholder in almost all circumstances. So in that sense, it means that you're probably directly linked to actual human rights violations in relation to conflict areas. What does that mean in practice? In practice, it does mean that you are not, in a sense, formally liable for the human rights violation. However, you have the responsibility to use your influence, to use your leverage, to make sure that those human rights violations stop. And so also for the paper we have made, this is a sort of starting point where your responsibility begins and also ends. So what does that mean in practice? Which steps can you as an investor take to tackle this topic? First of all, we know that conflict areas have existed. They exist now, and well, unfortunately, they probably will exist also in the years to come. So it's important to have a sort of policy, to have a sort of consistent policy based on guidelines, which also helps you to take a stance and to know how to act without taking a sort of political viewpoint. And what are the building blocks to do so? First of all, how do you identify conflict areas? For example, you can relate to certain lists that are available, for example, World Bank. You can explain the due diligence process you take to identify conflict areas and links to your investee portfolio. Step 3 is, if you have identified a company active in one of those areas, what do you logically expect from those investees? And last but certainly not least, of course, engagement is one of the key points. That's the leverage point in relation to the UNGPs. But it also links to other instruments within responsible investment, being it exclusion or, for example, proxy voting. So then the due diligence process. So how can you zoom in on companies at risk? And this is something that is still in development. But within the working group, we have they have identified 2 main ways you can go about in relation to due diligence. First of all, identify the conflict areas and just to see which investee companies are active in those areas. The other one is identify the companies which have a heightened risk in relation to conflict. For example, weapon production, mining, for example, surveillance, and many more sectors. Ideally, you would use both approaches to have a sort of solid, a sort of heat map, just to see where in your investment portfolio risks arise in relation to conflict areas. And last but not least, if you have those heat maps, it's important to zoom in. Is a company very directly involved in fueling the conflict? Is it maybe providing vital services? Because that also translates in the priority you will give, but also the questions you will ask in the end. Because maybe for some companies you want just that their activities in that country end, but for others, for example, companies providing vital services, you don't want them to leave such a country, because they are very important, well, to ensure that there is sufficient food supply, utility services, or healthcare. The due diligence process is not easy, so there's an important role for data providers, and hopefully also the data available will evolve in the years to come. But having those data still will require a step from you as an investor. What do you do with the outcomes? How do you integrate the findings? How do you prioritize your engagement efforts? So then we come to step 3. Probably you will identify the sort of heat map. You will identify a list of companies which are most logically to engage with on this topic. You can go about in 2 ways. Reactive. So maybe you see that for some companies they are already involved in conflict areas. They may be even involved directly or indirectly with human rights violations, and then you should pinpoint your engagement to make sure that the violation stops. And of course, there's access to remedy to the victims. But we also identified a sort of second engagement approach, and that's more proactive. So if you see that for certain companies, they are active in sectors and countries that are at risk, and maybe they are not involved yet that much, but they can be in the coming years, you can also proactively engage them and ask them just to do their due diligence to make sure that they have sufficient insight in the conflict. And as Heineke said, also zoom in on the context and on the impact and translate that in policy and action. And of course, last but certainly not least, report also on their approach and their actions towards investors, but also to other stakeholders. But what if these engagement efforts do not work? If the company is not swayed to take action? Well, also then you have several steps at your disposal. You can work together with other investors, for example, working on an investor statement. You can go to the annual shareholder meeting. You can use proxy voting. For example, if there are resolutions on the table, which was the case this year at London. But you can also use it at, for example, board nominations. So, for example, do you see if there is sufficient knowledge within the board, within the governance structure of an investee company to address those topics? And last but not least, if you really see that a company cannot move on this topic or does not want to move, or you see that a specific sector has such a big risk that it's very hard to mitigate, you can also link your actions to your exclusion policies. And the last step, also important for companies, but as well for investors, report on your process, your policy, and actions you've taken. So that are the 5 building blocks we have described in the guide, and we will be very happy today, but also afterwards when we have sent it to you, the guidelines, to hear your feedback and to hear if your questions are answered, or if there were any topics you would like to add and to be speaking on as well. So I've come to the end of the presentation. I hope it was clear, but would be very curious and very pleased to answer any questions. question.
Thank you so much, Frank. We'll open the floor for questions of the audience in a minute. Thank you about elaborating on proxy voting, and this is quite easily forgotten. It's also an instrument investors do have. With regard to information, you indicated there were some lists where you can start as an investor. But what are the sources you typically use? Because this is not the most research. There's not some research intensive regions always. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yes, I think in general, it's a topic that is becoming more addressed recently, but it has not reached the level of maturity of, for example, climate change. So I think there is data. I think the most data providers have already data that can be used to to execute a due diligence process for the investment portfolio. But there is quite some room for maturing and adding data and helping to make this due diligence process more efficient, also in pinpointing the main risks. So in that sense, it's a topic that's a little bit behind of the curve in relation to, for example, climate change or forced labor.
Okay, thank you. I would suggest that we stop the record and start with the questions of the audience.